There was ash everywhere. All of a sudden, the sky went really, really red, and then it just went pitch black. The people in the relief centre were amazing. There's a natural disaster happening, and they've got these beautiful smiles on their faces, and they greet you the minute you come in, or they talk to the kids. They're probably stressing themselves and worried sick, but you wouldn't know. So helpful.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Gary Starr. I'm the Executive General Manager of Business, Government and International here at Australia Post, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this event today, our third in our Australia Post Connect series, which is all about exploring critical issues for business and government. Today's webinar, which is all about connecting Australians in times of need, is incredibly relevant given what we're all going through at the moment with the pandemic, but also as we head into Australia's bushfire and summer storm season. Before we get started though, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we operate, live and gather, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. Now, some of you have joined us before and are familiar with the On24 platform, but just a few tips and a refresher for those who have used it before. So firstly, we'd love to get your questions, and that you can start right now with Q&A, and you'll see that widget on the screen. So please do post your questions, and we'll attempt to answer as many as possible through the course of the event. Now, the windows on your screen are configurable, so you can size them as it suits you in terms of the presentation and the speakers. And at the end of the session, we'd really appreciate if you could take the time to answer a very quick survey. It's literally a couple of minutes, and it's the second last widget on your controls. And as I said, just a minute or two, but the feedback is really valuable so that we can continue to deliver great events. Now, the webcast will be recorded and it will be available on the link that you've used today, but we'll also send out the link again within 24 hours. So for those who want to watch it again or pass it on, and for those who miss out, a chance to watch the event. So let's get into the event. Now, the fact that you've all joined us today in this conversation shows that you appreciate the importance of ensuring that Australians remain connected in times of need. So thank you and welcome to everyone today. One thing we know for sure, unfortunately, is that we will always experience crises and natural disasters. Australia is a land of extremes. We've also been shown time and again the incredible determination Australians show to pull together in times of crisis. I think we'd like to think that we're a resilient bunch. But just having that determination to pull together isn't always enough. You always need organisation, coordination, information, and you need to be prepared. Now, as all of you are managers, decision makers, business owners and work in businesses, we all have an important role to play in the coordination and support of our communities and customers during times of crisis. Many of us may not have formal crisis management training. So finding ourselves suddenly in the middle of an unfolding crisis and understanding how to manage the situation, what resources are available, can be really daunting. And knowing what to do and who can help is critical. And in the middle of a crisis, we can never really know how events will evolve or unfold. What we do know is that no matter what kind of crisis, flood, bushfire, or the pandemic that we've all been experiencing over the last 18 months, people will tend to react in similar ways and have similar needs. And there's a need for connection, a need for community, and a need for communication, and they remain constant. And I'm really excited that the three special guests we have today have extraordinary experience in these areas, and I look forward to them sharing some of their experiences with us very soon. Now, later we'll be chatting with the Australian Red Cross National Resilience Advisor, John Richardson, who's specialised in disaster recovery for 23 years. We're really proud at Australia Post of our connection with the Red Cross. We support their important work in helping communities affected by drought and bushfires. And last year we formed a national partnership agreement to strengthen the commitment and deepen our impact. And we'll also be speaking with Jeanette Hunt, who's been with Australia Post for 21 years. Now, Jeanette was the post office manager at Batemans Bay on the south coast of New South Wales, which was hit by bushfires in 2019. And I'm sure you'll all remember those fateful days across New South Wales and across the country. But first up, I'd like to introduce Shane Fitzsimmons, the former New South Wales Fire Commissioner and now Commissioner of Resilience New South Wales, which is the lead disaster management agency for New South Wales. Many of you would remember Shane for his role back in the 2019-2020 summer, guiding a statewide response in New South Wales, including a 74,000 strong crew of mostly volunteers through one of Australia's worst fire seasons. In that terrifying bushfire season, Australians were reassured by the exemplary leadership and empathetic presence of the then New South Wales Fire Commissioner. I'm also delighted to say that Shane, in 2021, was announced New South Wales Australian of the Year. And as a category sponsor for the award, Australia Post is really proud to celebrate inspiring Australians like Shane. So welcome, Shane. We're really honoured to have you with us today.
Oh, good morning, Gary. It's great to be with you and all the Australia Post team. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Great. Well, as I mentioned, you were the very public face of the New South Wales response in the 1920 summer and those bushfires which devastated much of the state, and as well as Victoria and ACT. And the statistics are really compelling. Across the country, 18.6 million hectares burnt, over 5,900 buildings destroyed, and tragically, 34 people lost their lives. But in New South Wales alone, where you were taking a lead, 5.5 million hectares were burnt, just under 2,500 homes, and sadly, 26 lives were lost. Responding to that level of devastation sounds like an impossible challenge, but can you just talk us through the first few days when the fires really started to take hold, just the enormity of the situation and what you had to deal with?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And reflecting on the start of that 1920 fire season, you won't find me using the phrase Black Summer bushfires, because I think it does do a disservice to so many communities that were impacted and affected by the fires that started well before summer. As a matter of fact, the outlook for the 1920 fire season was very similar, almost identical to the season before. But the difference with the 1920 fire season was, in winter, we were averaging more than 1,000 fires a month, June, July and August. And then the fire activity simply intensified as we moved into spring and then into summer. And as a matter of fact, we started to see considerable loss and our first lives lost up in northern New South Wales in spring. So we knew without any moisture, without any forecast, every day, every week, the forecast was just for continuing above average temperatures and below average rainfall. And the fire season was shaping up to be unprecedented. Fires were starting very, very easily, and they were spreading extremely quickly across the landscape, breaching conventional fire behaviour metrics and spread modelling that we've evolved over many, many decades here in Australia. So we knew from the earliest of the onset, particularly on the back end of the worst drought we've been experiencing in centuries, that it was shaping up to be a really difficult and disastrous fire season if we didn't get any rain. And as it turned out, Gary, we didn't get the rain until February. So we ended up in New South Wales as part of that national fire season. In New South Wales alone, we had more than 200 consecutive days of local bushfire emergencies declared right around New South Wales. It was unprecedented on so many levels: damage, destruction, longevity, behaviour, intensity, and of course the tragedy, as you mentioned, just under 2,500 homes and 26 lives lost, including 7 of our firefighters, 4 volunteer firefighters, Jeff, Andrew, Sam and Cole, and then our 3 air crew, the pilots and the crew that were flying the large water-bombing aeroplane, Rick, Ian and Paul, all perished when their plane crashed during firefighting operations down in southeast New South Wales. So it was a horrendous season on so many levels, and it was persistent, it was relentless, but so too was the perseverance, the tenacity, the commitment and dedication of our firefighters and emergency workers, but also the communities being impacted and affected. It was enormous, and the signals were there in the early parts of the season, which is why we focused that communication and that investment in resources and people and strategies to prepare ourselves for what was shaping up as an awful season.
So just with all that, and there were clearly precursors to this and signals that it was going to be pretty bad. But while all this is happening, I mean, you were a measure of control and consistent communication. But what do you say to people who might be feeling out of control and just keeping the calm? I mean, you just reeled off some pretty horrific stats, but how do you just help people stay in control?
So I think the key to that is leadership at any time, but leadership, particularly in times of crisis, is about seeking to build trust and confidence. Trust and confidence in your teams, your colleagues, your subordinates, your supervisors, so your organisation and partner agencies, but importantly, your customers or the community. And a key to that building trust and confidence is your investment in culture and leadership culture and systems and programs and resources ahead of the crisis. And when it comes to the crisis, being very factual, being very candid, de-jargonise your language, try and use simple phraseology, simple words that connect and relate, give confidence and assurance to your team that you've got their back and that we're in this together, but importantly to your customers and the community, that we understand and we empathise with the circumstances and we're being as open and as honest as we can be about the current situation and the forecast based on the conditions that we know, but also be open about the things we don't know, what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then what we're not doing or can't do and why that's the case. And most importantly, what do we want others to do? What do we want people to do to play their part in the effort to make a difference and save and protect as much as they could? So keeping it real, authenticity is absolutely fundamental, and pardon this crude phrase, Gary, but what I like to talk about in crisis is if you're dealing with a dog poop sandwich, you can't sprinkle hundreds and thousands on it and tell everybody it's fairy bread. They'll work it out pretty quickly. So I think don't exaggerate the circumstances, don't overstate them, but certainly don't underplay them. Be as authentic and as open and as transparent as you possibly can with what we're dealing with and what we're all going to do together to try and get us through as safe and as effective as possible.
Well, that's great advice, and I know you're no stranger to disaster yourself. You're a firefighter since 1985, and so you've obviously experienced a great deal on the front line. And your father was tragically taken in an out-of-control hazard reduction burn over a little 20 years ago. But so how do you? We're all human beings in the end. So how do you balance that instinctive emotional response with your role as someone who's in that leadership role and actually tasked with helping others?
I think in life, Gary, we grow and develop through lived experiences, personal lived experiences, or through the learnings of the lived experiences of others. And it helps build our resilience, it helps shape our character, our values, and our leadership attributes and qualities. And for me, going through hardship, going through adversity, it helps you build that resolve and that commitment to want to make a difference, a positive difference to others. So being authentic, and caring about what you're there for, and caring about your team, the job at hand, and the community or the customer you're serving and protecting, it also means that if you care and you're authentic, that you're also going to be vulnerable. And for me, throughout the fire season, unashamedly, I was emotionally broken several times, particularly when we lost life and lost the lives of our firefighters. But I was unashamed about that. Part of leadership, part of connecting with and caring about and valuing your workforce, your team, your community, your customers, is being connected, is having empathy, and remembering that, it's not about you, it's actually about others. That's that humility and that want to connect and be part of something. And I know through my own personal tragedy and experiences, I learned a lot then about the criticality of leaders in crisis being present, and particularly being present when we're having our darkest of moments, to be there, to provide that assurance, to provide that guidance, and to provide the latest, accurate, up-to-date information that we can, so that people can do their part and know that we're doing our very best to make a difference and keep them safe.
So how did you stay strong through that? Because it's one thing to fall every so often emotionally and have to deal with that and be vulnerable, but in the end, I'd see you turning up every day, and we've seen it through COVID with leaders. And, but having to get sleep, there are important things to do along the way, right? Because for you to be able to front up again and again. So how did you deal with that? Because it would have been exhausting, and emotionally and physically.
There is absolutely no doubt, Gary. You've hit it on the head. It was extremely draining, but what I kept reminding myself was, I've got a role to play, I've got a part to play in this remarkable, extraordinary team effort, and I won't ask of others what I'm not willing to do myself. I made sure that I spoke and connected with my colleagues, with my teams, about those emotionally difficult days, those draining days, those days when you're kind of overwhelmed and thinking, how much worse can this actually get? I had a really strong support in my wife and my family, so being able to reach out and converse from time to time. So it is about looking after yourself, but if the truth be known, on reflection, I didn't look after myself as well as I probably should have, with sleep and anxiety and those sorts of things. But it is a feature of crisis, and as long as you recognise that and realise that, there is no shame in reaching out, sharing, connecting, and utilising and accessing supports and assistance that are available to help you through that, knowing you're part of a team and you've got a role to play. It's not just about you, it's about everybody else and your part in that big team effort. So that's what helped me get through those really difficult and protracted periods of anxiety and high pressure.
Well, and it's interesting because my team and I sat down at Christmas last year and talked about getting through COVID and naively, unpacking it in the new year and at the start of this calendar year, not realising it would go on, and just the length of the pandemic, and just so it's staying resilient through that and how we come through. And I guess it was a very short but massively intense period for you. So just recovering from that and getting back to a BAU. But just on that note, you mentioned that there were clear signals it was going to be a bad season. And we often, there's not a throwaway line, but we talk about, we're a resilient bunch, Australians are resilient, but that does come down to planning. And the fact that the state of New South Wales established a resilience committee, you as the leader and a department focused on this. So I'm just interested in some of the strategies and initiatives of you and your team to build resilience in communities, because a lot of that's doing it before the crisis, right? And that puts you in a much better position. So I know it's early days, and you and I spoke at the start of this year when you were just really pulling a team together, but where are you at, and what are some of the things that will build a more resilient New South Wales?
Absolutely, Gary. And the preeminent focus in the establishment of our agency is the remarkable coordinated collaborative effort around recovery for communities following, the compounding effect of disasters, but particularly the bushfires. But as you say, looking forward, it is about identifying and planning. And I think COVID has been a leveller. It reminds us all that we are vulnerable and susceptible to disruption or displacement, whereas often disasters like natural disasters happen somewhere to somebody, and the rest of us move on with our busy lives. So the reality is, how do we get out there and identify what communities are vulnerable or susceptible to? Some are more prone to natural disasters or infrastructure disasters or what have you. But once you understand that, what are the things that can be done, low cost, no cost, right through to significant investments, to lift the resilience, to lift the readiness and the preparation and the ability of that community to withstand or better able to anticipate what might be impacting them into the future? How do we have the arrangements in place to adequately respond and deal with the disaster or the emergency or the crisis? And then what are the mechanisms that can come in very quickly in a joined up way to help with the recovery? And recovery, automatically people default to repair, reconstruction and replacement of infrastructure. But the massive element is the community and societal healing, the emotional and psychological toll that's occasioned on individuals, and the supports and the commitment to get out and normalise discussions around lived experiences. Resilience is about strength, it is about courage, it is about going forward, but so too is it about acknowledging that those lived experiences and those times of crisis come invariably with a big emotional toll. So our ability to look out for ourselves, to have conversations with our family and loved ones, with our mates, to share and normalise that being emotionally impacted is okay. And I think the biggest lifting for us, based on my experience over the last few decades, and particularly over the last 18 months, is us men, usually the older demographic of men, such as myself, where we've been indoctrinated for decades that men are strong and therefore they don't show emotion. The reality is we are all human beings, and you can't live through those crises, you can't live through those life-changing experiences and not be emotionally and psychologically impacted and affected. And talking about it is okay, and so is going out, getting support and assistance to help process your thoughts and your feelings, particularly not just the lived experience, but the taking stock of and the overwhelming contemplation of how do I pick up the pieces and go forward from here. So we've really got to get that balance right between the physical built environment and also the emotional elements as well.
So it's interesting, Sharon. I just noticed I know you've just moved into a new office and the lights, you're getting used to the technology then, the lights just went off. So thanks for waving around to get the lights back on. Before we came on air or onto the event, you were talking about just the number of tonnes you've been shipping, the amount of work you've been doing to ship, food around the state. And you talked about the bushfires and the floods. In many people's minds, that happened nearly a year ago. So how do we keep that front? So, and we'll talk to John later about the recovery effort and the Red Cross's role. But how do you keep it front of mind, and there's funding and there's focus on it and people's, because it seems that we're in the pandemic, a present pandemic, that's present tense, but the bushfires and floods happened nearly a year ago. For a lot of people, they're in the past, right?
Absolutely. And the reality is, whether it was the drought, the bushfires, the floods that came immediately after, the floods that we've had in March of this year, the new Delta variant of COVID throughout this year as well, we've had this succession of disasters that have been impacting communities. And for some communities, they've been impacted significantly and adversely by 3 or 4 compounding disasters over an 18-month, 2-year period. So the toll it takes on communities is extraordinary. And as part of the emergency management arrangements, as part of the disaster arrangements here in New South Wales, we rely on partnerships and connections and relationships with government and non-government organisations. And I know John's online, and I know Australia Post is there as well. But having identifiable community hubs, we should never underestimate the criticality of a post office in a local community. It's a common point. It's a meeting point. In some communities, it's the primary access point for connection, for information, for togetherness. But so those other partners like Red Cross and even through COVID, millions and millions of tonnes of food supplies and basic essentials and care products and sanitary products and all those sorts of things. We're moving out 500,000 kilos a week still across communities around New South Wales, some of which are purely COVID affected, others are the result of compounding effects. And those partnerships with government and charitable organisations and non-government organisations really require us to pull together, work with government, business cases, additional funding to get out and support and enable that local leadership, that local connection in communities to get to those that need it most. And what happens in one area can be notably different to what happens and is needed and is a priority in another area. And having arrangements that are in place that can accommodate the broad spectrum but be nuanced and flexible enough to tailor to the local need is really, really important. And it's part of an integrated, collaborative effort that is continuing as we speak.
Well, thanks, Sharon. That's a fantastic segue to the panel and to Jeanette's lived experience at Batemans Bay and John. So I could go and ask you lots of questions, but I appreciate your insights. And I'd now like to invite both Jeanette and John to join us on the panel. Now, Jeanette Hunt has had a career spanning 21 years at Australia Post. She's now at the Post Office Manager at Narooma Post Office on the Central South Coast, a lovely part of the world. But on New Year's Eve 2019, she was a Post Office Manager at Batemans Bay. And Batemans Bay, as you will all recall, was hit by terrifying bushfires. They were fierce and devastating and, smaller numbers, but in that area, 460 homes and 600 outbuildings in the Eurobodalla region were affected. And in their wake, as people struggled to cope, Jeanette and the Post Office Manager at the time at Batemans Bay opened the doors, and as Shane said, it became a makeshift service centre and a community hub for the town. So welcome, Jeanette, and really look forward to hearing about some of that lived experience shortly. And then John Richardson is the National Resilience Advisor for the Australian Red Cross. John has extensive experience over 24 years in preparedness, response and recovery in government, non-government organisation settings, but at individual, local, state, national and international levels. So really experienced in so many different parts of disaster preparedness and recovery and crisis. He led the development of the Red Cross unique preparedness program called Ready Plan. And John's worked closely with disaster-affected individuals and communities. So someone with a lot of knowledge in the space. So welcome, John, as well. So it's great to have you both here today, and I'll start with you, John, actually. You've coordinated recovery missions for the Bali bombings, the Alpine and Grampian bushfires in 2009, and helped the people of Strathewen in Victoria, where 20 people died in the Black Saturday fires. I remember that well, being a Victorian. And you helped those people to recover and build. So in your experience, how do Australians respond to disaster?
Yeah, thanks, Gary, and thanks for inviting me to be here. I guess the thing is that over this amount of time, and similar to Shane, it's certainly a privilege to work with people who probably, as one of my colleagues describes it, has probably had the worst day of their lives, and to be able to to be there and help them kind of navigate through what is a really complex, challenging, unnerving, sometimes rewarding process, a frustrating process is certainly it's certainly a privilege. And I think Australians respond to disasters in many different ways. You mentioned in your intro about us being a resilient lot, and in the main we are a resilient lot. And I think the thing to really recognise is that like in everyday life, no two people will experience the same disaster in the same way. One of the stories that I recall out of Strathewen where two people almost had very similar experiences. They had prepared their homes. They decided that their plan was to at that point to stay and defend. They did do that. In both instances, they sheltered in the house. Fire front came over, and then as the fire front passed, the house was actually caught fire. They were able to leave the house safely and shelter elsewhere. So really almost identical experiences. And one said, I thought I was going to die. And the other said, at no point did I think I was going to die. So they had almost, those sorts of experiences. So these are the sorts of things you've got to kind of recognise, is that everyone will experience things differently. We've also got to be really mindful of broader narrative where, and a lot of it, I hate to say this, but a lot of it's a little bit Hollywoodized. It's kind of like there's goodies and baddies, and usually there's a scientist in there who's not listened to, and all that sort of stuff. But media do kind of portray it in a fairly simplistic way, and then generally. Once the fires are out or the floodwaters are receded, we tend to forget about that. And again, I think, Gary, you made that point of people thinking about, bushfires were last year, and yet for many people, and I know, Jeanette, you were saying this just before we came on, many people, it's still very relevant for them because, they're still recovering. So we need to be talking about, the narratives that, that are around what happens months and years later. So, people do get exhausted. They have to deal with a lifetime of major life events all at once. If you think about, whether you have to, you have to bury loved ones, bury stock, pets. You might find yourself unemployed. You may have to move, rebuilding relationships. Now, all these things we deal with over the course of our lives, but for many people in disaster-affected areas or experience these sorts of disasters, it happens to them all at once, and so that can be that can be sort of pretty tough. But I think one of the things we've certainly seen is how people come together, and so this is where social cohesion, our bonds. That we already have in place, that they come through, and this is the power of connection in communities. So you see that we kind of go into problem-solving mode, and people really want to kind of I'm in adrenaline. I'm just gonna solve these problems. I've got a bunch of problems in front of me. I'll talk to people I've never talked to before in my community, or even people that I hate. And we do these see Hatfields and McCoys getting on. So you do have that now. That is that kind of really early stage, and that will persist, and then over time that may change. So that's where it's kind of really important that's where you want to be kind of providing support to get people through. And look, I think the other thing is really important to recognise is that people aren't helpless. There's a sort of myth about panic. I think people panic, and sure, look, if you are facing death, then like a fire front is coming at you or whatever, then there may be that. But in the main, most people's behaviours are pretty purposeful. They want to get themselves out of a difficult situation. But often there's a sort of, we kind of sort of see people who are in this sort of state and it seems like they're helpless, but they're actually, they're actually kind of getting themselves sort of organised. And this is, we see this a lot with communities where they do self-organise, and that's kind of what we want. We want to be able to support that because, ultimately, when the sort of systems, do kind of wind down, you want people to be kind of taking the ownership of it. So we sort of see that, and I guess in the end, probably to sort of think about it, and Shane made this point around sort of growth and lived experience. So we will see people who have this will profoundly affect them for perhaps the rest of their lives, and there is a sort of small but significant proportion of people that might be an issue. But another thing we're sort of starting to sort of see in the a lot of the literature and a lot of what people are telling us is that this sort of kind of phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. So it's not sort of like, oh geez, I'm glad I had a disaster, so I can feel I feel better, but it really is about I've been through something bad and I've really made some decisions and thinking about how I want to live my life, and I've come out of this the other side effectively a better person, and so we do sort of see that as well. So I think it's a complex thing, and Australians do respond in the, generally they will respond, really, really positively. We obviously have challenges going forward with, as Shane sort of mentioned, around sort of compounding sort of disasters is going to be certainly really challenging.
Right. Well, there's a lot there, and I guess there's that you talked about the point of crisis and then what happens afterwards in communities, becoming, it just sounds comforting, self-supporting, support from agencies and organisations like the Red Cross, but then being able to support each other and themselves. But Jeanette, I'll turn to you now. So in that moment of crisis or adrenaline in Bateman's Bay, what was your, what was your first reaction? And just talk us through how the Bateman's Bay Post Office filled the void for the community at the time, because I understand it would have been lots of people, a crisis happening. So what did you experience?
Well, when the fires first started, we were in that situation where the fires were actually burning around us for 6 weeks prior to coming into town. So we've been on alert for quite a few weeks, not knowing from one day to the next what was going to happen. But when the fires did finally hit the town, it did all happen very quickly, and so many people were lost. We had no power. Australia Post became one of the very few places that were open in town. We sort of provided cash for customers. There was no power, so none of the ATMs were working, none of the banks were open, and the few businesses that were opening were only operating with cash. So people were coming to us for cash withdrawals because we were able to supply for them. They had no power. We were charging people's mobile phones. We were selling phones to people because all the power lines, phone lines were down, and some people only had no communications without phones. We helped people with internet access, mail after the fires, their mail redirections and holds, so they had somewhere for all their mail to go to. There was a big need to help the businesses with, we lost a lot of businesses to help them get goods out, the ones that were still operating, and places holding mail for businesses, that had nowhere for their mail to be delivered to, and it was the simple things being for the community of batteries, radios, battery-operated radios, and just general information, because people didn't know where to go to get information because everything was closed, and they all knew the post office was open, and they were coming to us just for that general information of, you know, what was open, what wasn't open. So we became a very important part of, you know, the community during that time.
And just aside from you've talked about some of the physical things, but what did the community need? You know, it was also a meeting point, and how did the community engage at the post office, or was it a place people could come and just also engage with others who were experiencing the same thing?
It was a place because people, you know, were meeting up with each other there, because, like I said, we are the hub. Australia Post is the hub of so many communities. People were coming to us because we were operating fairly well as normal. They felt normal. They felt safe. They knew it was somewhere safe that they could come to. They could express their feelings with us, and it's that trust Australia Post have in their communities that really help with help people.
Right, and John, I know you've helped communities through coping through disaster, and we've spoken a little bit about this, but could you just talk us through the role the Red Cross plays with recovery, and so at the start, I guess, and how that may then transition to them being able to look after themselves or support each other?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Look, I suppose we're in most of the state plans across the country, which, you know, and providing different sorts of, basic psychosocial support, supporting people's health, emotional well-being. So that, being there at the start, I think is really important in terms of for communities. A bit like what Jeanette said, we've got kind of recognisable sort of entity. It's people are drawn to that sort of familiarity. So, seeing an organisation like Red Cross, and others in evacuation centres, kind of people make that connection. We sort of look to, I suppose, establish recovery programs where, where there's a gap, where there's a need. Quite often, and I remember this is what we said to our, the recovery team that we appointed after the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria in 2009. We sort of said basically, get in the car and go out and drive around and sit in bakeries and cafes and pubs for a couple of months and just listen. Hear what people have got to say, and start to kind of get a sense of where the gaps are. And so, they found that a bit unusual. They sort of felt like they should be doing something, but we sort of said, just be, just listen. And then they came back and sort of said, look, it appears to be like a gap in parenting information. And one of the key things is being able to kind of connect people in sort of an outreach way so that agencies can be connected to people in their homes. So they developed sort of programs sort of around kind of meeting, those sorts of needs. And so I suppose that's the sort of thing where, we recognise that the, recovery takes a long time. We've been involved in research at the University of Melbourne. So you need to be kind of thinking about it sort of long term. Bringing people together. And one of the great important things about the research, I'd have to say, is that I remember a couple of times when I've wanted to, in previous roles, I wanted to sort of fund things like community barbecues, and sort of having had sort of finance type people sort of saying, well, what's the value of that? This is public money, this is donated money. How can we be sort of, using that for a barbecue? And so, being able to say, well, it's not the barbecue, it's actually bringing people together so they can have a chat, You know, they can talk to each other, they can compare notes, talk about their experiences and that sort of thing. And that's really important. It's that kind of connection thing. You know, getting people together and allowing them to sort of be part of something bigger. Another thing that we sort of do also is being able to kind of provide, I guess, what we call psychoeducation, which is just sort of information that can help people navigate through, you know, through the you know, the recovery process. We use a range of different sort of people. They might be, you know, expert psychologists. They may be people who have actually been through this experience previously. Because that's one of the challenges for people, is that they're kind of there in the middle of it and they're kind of going, how am I going to get out? Like, I can't see my way out of this. Like, it's, I'm here, but I can't see my way out of it. And like, I remember, you know, the Bali bombings, a group of people we were working with, we brought in somebody who had survived Port Arthur. And, you know, he came in and said, you know, he said, I've just come off the golf course and, you know, and talked about his whole experience. And so people can then suddenly say, oh, there is a future. And, you know, that's sort of part of, I suppose, you know, psychosocial support. And when we talk about, you know, promoting hope. So that sort of education, information in different formats is helps people kind of go, oh, okay, so I'm not alone, and there is a way forward. And so, you know, being able to sort of provide that in sort of really simple and accessible terms. Now, that's been challenging with the pandemic, because that, you know, has meant that some of the stuff that we would normally do where it is sort of face to face has been obviously tricky with where, you know, we've obviously had stay-at-home orders and things like that. Flip side of that, though, is moving online, as we've probably also been able to sort of reach much further as well, and probably get to a whole lot more people than perhaps we wouldn't have got with face to face. So, you know, delivering a session on sort of parenting after disaster. You know, I did an interview with you know, a radio station in sort of I think it's Eyre Peninsula in South Australia, and they probably wouldn't have got there because, you know, the distance and that sort of thing. But being able to do that and make it available, you know, that's been kind of, I guess, one of the advantages of sort of moving online. So again, range of different things. Try and meet sort of people where they're at, and acknowledge sort of what they're going through, and hopefully, you know, provide them with a bit of a sort of pathway forward.
So there's a lot in that, and it seems to me both the just rebuilding infrastructure, but then the whole psychosocial and emotional piece is massive, and can be weeks, months, and years, and there's a lot there. Shane, just one last question, and then we'll go to Q&A. John has mentioned it, and you mentioned earlier about the criticality of partnerships. So, just interested to understand your thoughts on this. You know, what are some great examples that have stood out for you around partnerships? Because there are hundreds of people on this at this event, business and government, small, medium, large, and government departments. So, interested to hear what role they can play, how they can partner with you guys, with Red Cross, with Australia Post. Just keen to hear what you've seen as some good examples of that.
Some very real examples just coming out of the bushfire. I don't believe anything can be achieved without partnerships and collaboration. And the best led anything is that which is locally led. So at the source of the challenge or the disaster or the crisis, and for those that aren't part of that local body and we're removed from it, how do we provide the architecture to provide the support and the guidance and the assistance, the enablement and the empowerment to let them get things done? Some really significant programs, and Australia Post have been partners, Red Cross have been partners, but I look at the clean-up. We cleaned up on behalf of communities over 3,600 properties. We went to a major contractor, Lang O'Rourke, and we said, we need this project undertaken, but one of the conditions we want is local businesses engaged from these communities that are impacted so we can get livelihoods sustained and economies turning over. And they did that with 99% of local businesses from the impacted areas coordinated, and we did over 3,600 properties. Another partnership with organisations like Minderoo, Salvation Army, Red Cross, where we put temporary accommodation pods so that people can stay on their land because they don't want to leave their land while they're rebuilding their homes. And we provided over 200 of those. I mean, the food bank example that we just talked about, Red Cross, Food Bank, Oz Harvest, dozens and dozens of community organisations getting out and distributing to local communities with food supplies and bare necessities. Community organisations that just stand up and pop up through remarkable volunteerism. Blaze Aid organisations, volunteers coming together to help primary producers and farmers rebuild fencing. So there is not an aspect of the response and recovery effort that doesn't rely on collaboration. Small, medium and large organisations, charitable organisations, business partnerships. I think the challenge is going forward, and one of the things we've certainly got on our radar, Gary, is we see this remarkable outpouring of love and compassion and care and support when the disaster happens. How do we capture that energy and build those partnerships ahead of the disaster so we can invest more together in preparedness, in planning, in readiness, so that we're joined up and we understand our strengths and our limitations and our weaknesses, and how do we then support one another to ready ourselves to then work closely with community to better withstand, endure the disaster, but then bring that same energy together for the recovery, the rebuilding and the healing processes that will follow. So a whole section in my new organisation is dedicated to partnerships, and we're very keen on that. Private, public sector, charitable, small, medium, large organisations. There's a role for all of us critically when it comes to working with and being a part of our local communities.
Well, that's great, and I guess we know that we're working with the Red Cross to get more information out, but there are lots of people listening to this event that can reach out to New South Wales, to your organisation, and certainly to us through the Q&A or to your account manager to get more information about that. But I like what you said. I think really important around at the time of crisis, people, the outpouring of love and support. How do we get ahead of the curve and get organisations and partnerships involved in the resilience work up front to build a layer of a resilience leader, because we know sadly there will be further weather events and crises for Australians in the future.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, well,
Absolutely.
we may now go to the Q&A. So I have some questions here from the audience. I'll start with Shane. This is an interesting one. It's a promising and positive question from Stephanie at Charles Sturt University. And the question is, what are some of the avenues to begin a career in emergency management to help support communities before, during and after a crisis? So for Shane, so what...
Oh, there's absolutely loads of different ways. And I think, did you say the lady was from Charles Sturt University?
Yes.
So we're even working right now with Charles Sturt University on the campus up on the mid-north coast around programs and courses to help understand resilience in community leadership and disaster management. And there are courses and programs available on risk management and disaster management, but also join a volunteer organisation, pursue interests in government and non-government organisations. Interestingly, I think more and more the dialogue now is disasters just don't happen to someone else. Crises don't happen to some other organisation or department. So whether we like it or not, individually and collectively, whether it's at the very personal level or at our family level, whether it's in our business and employment level, whether it's running a farm or another operation to form a livelihood, or whether it's a community more broadly, the conversation and narrative around understanding and appreciating what we're vulnerable or susceptible to, the disaster or the crisis or the emergency or the displacement, being aware of it and personalising it is really important, but then so too is being part of something that plans for it, readies ourselves for it, deals with it and recovers from it afterwards. And I would say if you've got a good career or you're studying hard now, start volunteering. There are so many large organisations and local organisations that are part of community, that are part of disaster preparedness, and at the core of disaster resilience and community resilience is community, however you define that. And it means something different to someone else, but it's about being a part of something belonging to something and making a difference in your local area.
That's great advice, Shane. And I remember in my previous life at Motorola, one of my colleagues was in the RF Rural Fire Service and flew planes and had really advocated back into the organisation around mapping, understanding where the fire hazards were, and just his volunteering alone was incredibly valuable. But what he could advocate back to industry was very powerful. So it's a great idea.
Absolutely.
I guess
Absolutely.
Some sort of education, but also just frontline getting in and getting your hands into something you're interested in. The next question is for Jeanette, it's someone anonymous. But Jeanette, based on your experience, what tips do you have for others in frontline services to help them prepare for these types of situations?
I don't know, really exactly how you prepare for it, but you just need to be have that community mindedness, know what's going on around you. Be involved. Keep involved with the local Red Cross and the fire brigade, and it's a sense of community involvement. You keep yourself involved in the community, so you're aware of what's going on and what support services are around you that you can help your customers and your staff and that with.
And is there anything, Jeanette, that you take from, I guess, based on that experience at Bateman's Bay, and now that you're in Narooma, and sadly it could happen again, there could be a weather event there, or, anything you do differently, and I guess you're saying getting to know the local community and that infrastructure and partnership so that you are ready and able to react quickly. But is there anything else that comes to mind based on what you saw at Bateman's Bay?
Well, it's the little things. What we found that caught a lot of people out, it was the little things like a lot of people became complacent because we had fires burning for so long around us. And it's those little things like having petrol or diesel in your vehicle, having some cash, because there was literally none of either around, you know what I mean? And listening to official information channels. That was another thing. So much misinformation. You've got to learn to listen to the official channels all the time, and and all that will help. But the big thing was, a lot of people got very complacent down our way because, like I said, we hadn't burning fires and they're burning for so long, and you've just got to be prepared, at all times.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for that. And this is a question for both Shane and John. Alison at Flagstaff Group. And the question is, how can we connect better to vulnerable community members during an emergency when they have high anxiety, don't understand what is happening, or may be alone and unable to evacuate themselves? So maybe I'll start with John and then go to Shane.
Thanks, Gary. And a great question, and certainly a group of people that are certainly high at risk. Look, I think the key thing is not during the emergency, but starting before the emergency. So really, this comes into sort of preparedness and working with either the people who might be more at risk, more vulnerable, working with their families. So often we just sort of focus on individuals, but we talk about, as part of our sort of preparedness sort of programming, to develop a key three. So who are the three people who are sort of close by, who you can rely upon for information, who you can rely upon for practical support, and who you can rely upon for emotional support. They might be, quite different people. They're doing your sort of preparedness as sort of part of a broader group, having a conversation with service providers as well. So if people are getting in home support, then that's really important to sort of have those conversations if you sort of understand, if you're in high risk areas, what might happen. And making sure we check in on people. So as sort of warnings, are being issued, then, we can be sort of talking sort of early and keeping people informed. Most people are vulnerable. Again, they know their vulnerabilities, so they do have capacity to deal with stuff. So they know their vulnerabilities, but they do need a plan. And so I think that's probably the key thing, is really talking to, you know, that kind of broader group of support network, doing that early, help involving people in that conversation who might be at risk, so that they're confident about what's going on. And then, you know, then hopefully we don't get into that situation. That's what we're really, you know, as a sector, that's what we're really trying to focus on, is we don't want to be in that situation. So
right.
Do the planning.
Right. And Shane, anything that you want to add to that?
Well, the only thing I would add is, and my apologies if I've interpreted the question slightly inaccurately, but when it comes to some of our most vulnerable or disadvantaged communities, it is, as John said, having them identified. So, for example, in New South Wales, through our emergency management arrangements, we have what we call an EICU, an Emergency Information Coordination Unit. We have a vulnerable communities data layer that looks at local communities and the state to identify those communities, and then have some of the plans and the predetermined arrangements in place, depending on the hazard type and depending on their exposure. Often relocation, displacement or evacuation is the last thing you want to do. So it's actually about having strategies and plans and concepts in place for how to manage, how to secure, how to protect them, depending on the different hazard or the different set of circumstances. So absolutely, I would echo John's comments, but it's not horses for courses. There's no blanket solution on how best to deal with any community, let alone aspects of the most vulnerable or the most disadvantaged in those communities. Right.
So one other question here, which is for Shane, which is from Shane at SA Police. And the question is, it's often hard to find a metric to see the value in some community activities, which creates hurdles in justifying them. Given this, do you think we as a country are doing enough regarding prevention as opposed to reactive strategy, and who should be leading the charge on this? It's a great question.
It's a great question, and I would agree with the premise of the question that it is often very difficult to put a quantitative value on the investment around things like community engagement, preparedness activities, prevention activities. If we could do one thing alone, and the research shows this over and over again, if we could lift community apathy and lethargy when it comes to one's own vulnerability or susceptibility to a hazard, we'd be making remarkable inroads. But I do know different sectors, different agencies, different jurisdictions, we are modelling and sharing those metrics, those models and those methodologies that seeks to quantify, you know, a value invested here yields results over here to this value. And that is occurring. But we do know, unfortunately, that people often say, yes, I know I'm in a high-risk area, but they don't actually personalise that risk and then convert that insight into action around their own preparedness. So notwithstanding the broader community concept, what do people do about their own business, their own home, their own property? And we know through the research, high percentages, 70% plus, people invariably say, I knew I should have, I could have, and if only I would have done more to prepare myself, my home, and my family, my property, I know we would have come out of this better. And you can understand it because often disasters can be many years apart if you live in a particular area. They're not something that happens every day. So how do we lift that natural... I love our Australian culture. She'll be right, mate, no worries. But it doesn't cut it when it comes to disasters and crises. We've got to be more attuned. And I think the events of the last 18 months have reminded us all that we are vulnerable and susceptible to things from time to time, but there is a genuine pendulum shift at all levels of government, in enterprise, in business, that we need to invest more materially and emotionally into the preparedness and prevention and mitigation realms, whilst also sustaining the response and the recovery elements that happen with disasters and crises.
Right. Yeah, well, it's a really challenging issue, isn't it? Look, there are a few more questions. We are out of time. I may ask you, Shane, in 30 seconds or less, because this is one that I'm sure everyone would like to hear. This is from Simone at the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation. To be a resilient leader, what is your top tip for others based on your lived experience?
My lived experience is authenticity. Don't be a poser. Don't pretend to be someone or something you're not. People already see your vulnerabilities and your strengths in any case. That's what they want to see in normal time and in times of crisis. As leaders, none of us are any better than anybody else. We are all equals when it comes to crisis and when it comes to operations. We've just got different roles to play as part of a team effort. So humility is key. Take what we do very seriously, but don't take ourselves too seriously. And remember, it's all about others. So the more we can connect and understand and appreciate what's going on in the worlds of others and their perspectives and their experiences, the better we're able to communicate. Respect is critical, mutual respect. Growing up, I was told manners cost you nothing, but the lack of them can cost you everything. So when it comes to times of crisis, if we can maintain civility and courtesy, we can have robust debates and arguments, but we can land on considered decisions and explain those decisions. Communicating is key. Update what we know, what we don't know, what we expect and why we expect that, what we're doing and why we're doing that, what we're not doing or can't do and why that's the case. And then the final thing I would say, apart from the obvious about just make a decision and take action, don't procrastinate, don't let the pursuit of perfection get in the way of progress. The final thing would be leaders need to care. They need to care about their role, they need to care about their teams, they need to care about their organisation, they need to care about their customer and their community. And if they don't, why are they there? If you don't care, it's time to move on and let someone else step in who does care. And if you genuinely care, it'll come through in the decisions, it'll come through in your behaviour, it'll come through in your communications, and it'll come through in your humility and your empathy. That's where I would summarise that really quickly.
Wow, that's a great answer in a very short time. Thank you, Shane. There's a lot in that for everyone, so thank you. And a big thank you to Jeanette and John as well. I'm sensitive to staying on time, so thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your experiences, vast experience over a long, long time, both lived and some of the theory, and there are some great thought provokers there for us to take away. I think the partnership piece is important, the getting prepared piece is important, and go out and volunteer and get involved was another great piece of feedback. So thank you so much for taking the time out to join this event, and thank you to all of you for joining this Australia Post Connect event. I hope that you've been able to take something away. Do reach out to your account manager, put it into the Q&A, very happy to follow up, and that you can take something back to your communities, to your organisation, or for your own families and loved ones. So thank you for joining, and stay safe. All clear? Well, thank you, everyone.